We read the documents live stream. Your host, John Brisson. Thank you for being a subscriber. If you want to support my work, buy me a coffee/We've Read. Thank you for everyone who donates. If you want to subscribe to my work, search We've Read the Documents on Odyssey, Patreon, and Substack. Substack gives you the most access to my work. You get access to my written content as well as my Spotify link if you want to listen to my podcasts or my streams on audio format. My fellow brother in Christ and I, Jeremy Stone, have a Christian podcast, By Their Fruits. You can see that wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. God bless each and every one of you. So I have been listening to, as I'm door dashing, the audiobooks of the infamous Russian theosophist Helena Roerich, who was Elvis Presley's favorite theosophist, by the way. So we're going to be doing a study of the Theosophy of Helena Roerich and the pushing of Theosophy by her in America and modernizing it. And so first we're going to start with a brief discussion, and I'm not going to read all of this today. I'm going to read about half of it, of the embracement of Theosophy by the Franklin Roosevelt administration through Henry Wallace. Okay, so, oh no sound, no. It says it's count. You should be getting. Is anybody else having audio issues? Saying it's okay on my end. Okay, I'm gonna continue. Let me people know in the chat if you guys can hear me. All right, Searching for the Inner Light: The Development of Henry A. Wallace's Experimental Spiritualism by Mark L. Kleinman. Henry A. Wallace was for a time the 20th century Iowa's favorite son, yet he's usually remembered for his greatest failure, resounding defeat as a third-party candidate on the Progressive Party ticket for the presidency in 1948. He deserves a better fate. In the years predating his government service, Wallace was both a preeminent agricultural scientist and a prominent Midwestern agrarian leader as editor of his family's Iowa-based farm journal, Wallace's Farmer. During the Great Depression, as Franklin D. Roosevelt Secretary of Agriculture, Wallace was more closely associated in the public consciousness with the New Deal than perhaps anyone save Roosevelt himself. And Wallace's crusade for a century of the common man, undertaken as a vice president during the Second World War, made him the outstanding American champion of cooperative post-war international relations. Despite his personal success and public contributions, Wallace often has been recalled in rather derogatory terms, especially as some sort of fuzzy-minded mystic. Widespread assertions during the 1948 presidential campaign characterized Wallace as a starry-eyed dupe of the Communist Party. The image was augmented by the general culture climate of the Cold War era. Such assessments of Wallace's personality helped undermine the credibility of the policies he advocated. By the late 1960s and 1970s, in the context of wide-ranging criticisms of American society and culture, valuations of Wallace greatly improved. Various writers noted his contributions to American political culture and in some cases even insisted that Wallace had been ahead of his time as a political thinker. In these later works, however, the question of Wallace's spiritualism, so damning in the minds of earlier critics, was either sidestepped or not explored to its fullness, thus rendering even more favorable treatments incomplete. Attempting to understand Wallace's career without grasping the nature and extent of his spiritualism is to perform something of a historical lobotomy. It denies Wallace a part of his personality and deprives his ideology of one of its essential components. Wallace turns to politics in the 1930s and 1940s to remedy the ills of American society is well documented, as is his lifelong commitment to agricultural science. Yet despite widespread speculation about his spiritual eccentricities, there exists no thorough study of his actual spiritual pursuits in the years before he entered political life. The object of this article is to show that Wallace's spiritual quest during the 1920s and 1930s formed an essential part of his complete philosophical outlook, and that in the age of increasingly separated science and religion, his spiritualism complemented his scientific experimentalism. Thank you, Missy. So, We have New Age theosophical spirituality combining with scientific experimentalism. And that's the discussion I've had ongoing on this channel, is you have Malthusianism, which kind of represents the current world order, which is kind of your main Council on Foreign Relations, Bilderberg-esque talking points of, we have to curtail population due to climate change and eugenics, in doing so, we have to limit the world's population. You have kind of like the Georgia Guidestones, R.C. Christian's renewed common sense as a backdrop to that of keeping the world's population low so that it's in balance with the earth. So that's kind of like your Malthusian take, right? And then you have your anti-Malthusian take of the World Future Society, echoed by Theosophy and Neo-Theosophy, of Elon Musk being a Neo-Theosophist, a natalist, to the max. I am myself am a natalist too, but God said, "Go forth and multiply," right? But to them, they're not looking at it as fulfilling God's commandments of having children and hopefully raising them up in the ways of the Lord. But instead, it's to have more guinea pigs that you can experiment on. And you also need more guinea pigs in the hope that some of those guinea pigs can arise and fulfill their quote-unquote complete human potential and solve the problems that mankind is facing, okay? So it's an anti-Malthusian human potential take. Okay. So scientific experimentalism plays into that. And we have that, and there's not much I can really talk about being on YTube, but it kind of plays into the COVID pandemic, the Jabba Dabba Doos, and Operation Warp Speed through Operation Tiberius, Kirk, and Palantir, monitoring everything and controlling, with the military-industrial complex and the scientific complex and the, conventional medicine complexes, entering into artificial intelligence, everyone's past, present, and future medical history that got a stabby, and, through AI, tracking through manufacturing, distribution, shots in arms, what happens afterwards, what happens immediately, gaining all of that data for the refinement of mRNA. Now, I believe it's because they believe that it holds the secrets to longevity. Barbara Marx Hubbard, another neo-theosophist, has talked about the mythical qualities of mRNA. She wrote about it in the 1980s. We know that Alice Bailey in Theosophy, they worship the atom. You have Trump needing more nuclear power plants being built. Be damned their environmental costs, but more being built for artificial intelligence for Operation Stargate. So they worship mRNA. They worship the atom. Okay, these are called Christ, quote unquote, like abilities. Okay. So, as a whole, to wrap this back up, to tie this back up, you have the spiritualism with the scientific experimentalism. You have the mythical, magical properties of mRNA that are discussed, manipulating that for humans to reach their quote-unquote full potential so that they can be gods, which we know is impossible. Mixing that in with true scientific experimenting on the population with mRNA to see what happens. Okay. So, again, this is a key component of Theosophy and has been a key component of it and its propagation to the New World Order. Currently, we live in the current world order, but to the beast system's New World Order, this is what it is. Okay. And we've been primed throughout society through science fiction, which is mostly came from the World Future Society, and I've talked about that. In my various streams, you have famous science fiction authors and producers of media like Gene Roddenberry and Isaac Asimov and Stanley Kubrick, Ray Bradbury, Ray Kurzweil, etc., that were members of the World Future Society. Okay. So hopefully what I'm saying makes sense. This is someone else writing about Henry Wallace, okay, literally saying what I've been saying on this channel for years. And you can even have our modern science. You can go back in a previous stream that I've done, and Chabad Lubavitch mentioning that modern science comes from Kabbalah, another spiritualism practice mixed in with scientific experimentalism. And you can go watch probably Alexandria's excellent video on the occult roots of evolution. And evolution plays into both a scientific idea, later spiritualistic idea of conscious evolution, that we can choose to evolve, which is an anti-Malthusian belief, which is espoused in Neo-Theosophy. So it does all connect. Wallace inherited a background in agricultural science. His grandfather, Uncle Henry, left the Presbyterian ministry to begin an agricultural career in 1877. Quickly proved adept at scientific farming, making use of all the latest techniques of husbandry. Uncle Henry's son, Henry C. Wallace, Henry A.'s father, carried the interest in experimental farming further for a short time as a professor of agriculture at Iowa State College in Ames. Thus, it's not surprising that one of Henry A.'s careers is in agricultural science, specifically corn genetics. Which, that'd be selective breeding, which I'm fine with. Humans have done that throughout the centuries. It's different than genetically modifying using various scientific techniques to make genetically modified crops, right? Probing the mysteries of agricultural breeding in both plants and animals remained Wallace's great passion throughout his life. During the 1920s and early 1930s in particular, Wallace engaged in agricultural experimentation in areas ranging from innovative methods of corn cultivation to care and breeding of hogs and poultry. And Wallace devoted his life exclusively to those endeavors, especially to genetics. His contributions, important as they were, would have been vast. Wallace also studied weather and natural phenomena prediction, an area of experimentation pertinent to agriculture. Throughout the 1920s and early 1930s, he tracked the results of a wide range of research. For example, he supported experiments in long-range weather forecasting based on correlation of changes in solar radiation with ocean temperatures, even though such research was at that time regarded skeptically. He also followed research on his own influence of the moon's phases on crop planting. On his own, Wallace studied patterns of planetary alignments, terrestrial magnetism, earthquakes, and volcanic eruptions. He believed that all or some of those phenomena may have connected to terrestrial weather. During the early 1930s, Wallace wrote editorial weather columns in Wallace's Farmer based on the research on the relationship between the Earth's weather and the positions of the planets of the solar system. Ultimately, he combined his meteorological and natural phenomenological studies with an interest in statistics by using the new and still fairly primitive punch card technology to collate his large mass of planetary data. Wallace's scientific experimentalism included wide-ranging correspondence with those who shared his interest. By the late 1920s, the correspondence extended throughout the world, contributing to Wallace's growing awareness of international interdependence. Wallace's political career eventually pulled him away from science, yet his interest in the scientific matters never waned. Throughout his years in Washington, D.C., Wallace remained abreast of various science-oriented issues and was viewed by some as a scientist in public office. Physicist Vannevar Bush. Now, it's very interesting about Vannevar Bush because the Trump administration, especially the head of the Science and Innovation Office, I think is what it's called. Let me see here. Trump Admin Science Office head. But yeah, Michael Kratsios. Well, I've read some of his statements, some of his speeches. He's the head of the Offices of Science and Technology Policy in the Trump administration. Talks a lot about the scientific golden age and the coming theosophical golden age, and it's talked about technology that would play into that. He's in his speeches has spoken a lot about Vannevar Bush quite often. So physicist Vannevar Bush, for example, believed Wallace was the only member of the Roosevelt and Truman administrations capable of fathoming the scientific intricacies of atomic energy. And we know through Alice Bailey that the Theosophists worship the atom. Okay, they love they love nuclear energy. However, they warn of kind of like a black and white duality of nuclear energy, and that it could either destroy the world through the atomic bomb or save the world through limitless energy. Understanding Wallace as a scientist helped explain his penchant for applying his conception of this scientific method. Essentially, a discipled open-mindedness to a whole range of issues outside of science. He was willing to examine any theory of knowledge, including those others might view as eccentric. Wallace recalled that in corn hybridization, he would not reject any samples out of hand because he had often seen apparently poor corn samples produce viable offspring. The only way to know that corn was worth was to crossbreed it and see what resulted. As with corn, so it was with other intellectual pursuits. Wallace refused to reject any creed or hypothesis a priori. No matter how superficially repugnant a particular preposition's conceptual basis might seem to some, Wallace treated it as worthy of consideration until examination and trial proved otherwise. Wallace's experimentalism informed his profound curiosity about the spiritual world. His spiritualism was in part a legacy from his grandfather, who'd gone to Iowa from Pennsylvania in 1860s as a progressive minister in the United Presbyterian Church. Although he left the ministry to take up farming and journalism, Uncle Henry's religious beliefs, grounded in social reform, themes similar to those he would make up the social gospel, continued to exert a profound influence in his life. Because of extraordinary closeness between grandfather and grandson, those beliefs had a similar effect on the younger Wallace. Yet even here, Henry A's proclivity towards the mystical was apparent. As a young man, he had rejected what he characterized as the severely logical sermons of the Presbyterians and temporarily adopted an attitude of scientific skepticism. Eventually, however, the spiritual beauty of the Mass drew him back to Christianity, specifically the Episcopal Church. So again, through rituals, right? And pomp and circumstance. By the late 1920s, Wallace's religious propensity led him to examine diverse belief systems, including Hinduism, Baha'ism, interesting, astrology, and American Indian religions, where the support of several individuals who shared his spiritual propensity. Wallace intertwined his science and his spiritual studies into a distinctive experimental spiritualism. Wallace was most captivated during the 1920s and early 1930s by the wisdom religion of Theosophy, a religious system eminently suited to Wallace's philosophical intertwining of science and spiritualism, where we get pseudoscience, right? Science so falsely called, as Paul wrote to young pastor Timothy, right? Science so falsely called, something I've talked about in depth in this channel. The Theosophical Society itself was created in New York in 1875, led by the charismatic and controversial Russian immigrant Helena P. Blavatsky and a spiritually inclined American lawyer, Colonel Henry Olcott. The society attracted predominantly solidity middle class, mostly professional people who were active in non-traditional forms of religion and spirituality. The organization grew fairly quickly to international proportions, ultimately developing many offshoots and experiencing several schisms. In general, the movement's leaders claimed that Theosophy transcended the cleavage between science and religion, very similar to the modern Institute of Noetic Sciences, which was, started and founded by the Council for National Policy. I've discussed the Institute of Noetic Sciences on this channel and what they push. They're even pushed in the alternative media, they were the so-called good guys in the third Dan Brown novel, The Lost Symbol, where the Freemasons and the Institute of Noetic Sciences were the good guys in that specific novel, trying to save Washington, D.C. and America. Okay. Whew, boy. This book explains a lot of what I've talked about in this channel, and kind of, if you've been paying attention, puts it all together. Okay. Quite fascinating. All right, let's continue. Let's go back a little bit. All right. The organization grew fairly quickly to international proportions, ultimately developing many offshoots and experiencing several schisms. In general, the movement's leaders claimed that Theosophy transcended the cleavage between science and religion by returning to an ancient wisdom tradition, there you go, the mystery schools, of the Far East. Theosophists asserted the supernatural revelation imparted to spiritually sensitive individuals by semi-divine beings could inform rational deductive reasoning about the nature of the physical world. Revealing the influence of various East Indian religious traditions, Theosophists called these near divinities masters or Mahatmas. Also derived from Eastern spiritualism was Theosophy's acknowledgement of the existence of an eternal process of reincarnation driven by the principle of karma. So we know that karma is a bunch of bunk. The Bible says that man is appointed once to die and then to judgment, so reincarnation does not exist. And, it's karma is based off of the laws of the universe, not God's laws. Okay. Wallace first approached Theosophy through the liberal Catholic Church, one of the main schismatic offshoots of the original Theosophical Society. Interesting. The Los Angeles-based sect was established in 1917 by Charles W. Ledbetter. Ledbetter's literally a pedophile. Literally. Okay. We got to do a whole stream on Ledbetter's writings and his pedophilia allegations. Okay. A former Anglican curate. The variations of Anglican Catholic ritual that he brought to Theosophy gave it greater credibility among Christians like Wallace. Well, Wallace wasn't a Christian. He's a Theosophist. As early as 1925, Wallace established contact with the church. Eventually, he was offered ordination in the group, which he turned down due to domestic affairs. He did, however, accept appointment as secretary of the church Des Moines Mission, as listed as such in the church's directory. Another of Wallace's early theosophical associations was George W. A. E. Russell, whom he first met in 1912 and became reacquainted with in 1930. Russell was an Irish poet and mystic, a central figure in the Irish literary renaissance of the late 19th century, which itself was strongly influenced by Theosophy. In the late 1800s, a common interest in mysticism and Theosophy brought Russell together with other contributors to the Iron Renaissance, such as William Butler Yeats, Charles Johnson, John Eglinton, and Charles Weeks. By the time Wallace met him, Russell had spent years studying religion, mysticism, and theosophy. His writings were heavily laden with the sense of supernatural realm that one could connect with only outside the city, only by getting back to the land, to the primitive earth. Foreshadowing a strange environmental philosophy that would later develop in the century, Russell wrote of the earth as a living, breathing being. After his mythic awakening to the awareness, he said, the earth began more and more to bewitch me and to lure me to her heart with honed entreaty. So again, worship of the creation instead of the creator. And, we do have Mother Earth, Gaia, scientifically put in Malthusianism, but also, mystically put in anti-Malthusianism. And, again, the difference is Malthusianists believe that we should limit progression. We should limit human population to save Mother Earth, where anti-Malthusianism, though they also worship Gaia as well too, to some degree, they believe that we can have more humans because science will eventually catch up through human potential, and human intelligence will be able to overcome destroying the earth and be able to respect the earth in the manner of what it needs to be respected, according to them. Hopefully that makes sense. All right. This fundamental idea that a return to the earth as a spiritual fountainhead could lead to a new era of human existence supported the other major facet of Russell's life, his activities as a leader in the Irish agricultural cooperative movement. His cooperative philosophy and his endeavors to implement it paralleled Wallace's own strong advocacy of cooperation and heightened Wallace's interest in Russell's land-oriented spiritualism. Impressed at the time by which he viewed as Russell's practical mysticism, Wallace sensed that Russell seemed to be really living in another world, yet clearly desired to have that other world come true in this world. Wallace lamented his own lack of Russell's apparent degree of faculty of mental movement in the spiritual world. Yet in defining Russell's spiritual abilities to a close but skeptical friend, he implied that he himself had some psychic experiences. Manifesting his experimentalist demeanor, Wallace insisted that it is a mistake for scientific and the common sense people to shut the door to some of the things which they cannot understand. Interesting use of language there, scientific people and common sense people. Again, we keep getting the buzzwords of science so falsely called and common sense, right? Autocracy put in the chat, religion is a method whereby a man reaches out towards God in an effort to find the spiritual power to express the divine potentialities in himself. Henry Wallace. Yep, that's very theosophical. The God within you, remember that you're a God, bunkum. That's in a lot of theosophy and New Age thought that comes from the mystery schools. It comes from the lie of the serpent told Eve, if you eat of the tree from the knowledge of good and evil, you shall never die. Right? God lied about that. All right, let's continue. By the early 1930s, Wallace's attraction to George Russell's spiritualism and to theosophy led to his involvement in a loose network of spiritualists. For Wallace, the primary focus of this fellowship was Charles Roos, a poet and lyricist as well as an aficionado of Native American culture. From childhood, Roos had lived with Indians, woodsmen, and hunters and worked as a miner, a cowboy, and a woodsman. He's clearly at home in the outdoors. In the 1930s and 1940s, Roos and his wife Juanita, also a lyricist and a newspaper editor, served as United States government inspectors for all Indian reservations west of Michigan. Their lyrical and poetic work focused largely on nature, the wilderness, and Native American life and knowledge. Wallace's frequent and enthusiastic letters to Charles Roos indicate that he enjoys Roos was interested in spiritual knowledge. Wallace asked Roos, for example, about the interpretation of various Native American symbols he came across in his correspondence with other individuals. Eventually, Wallace even had Charles and Juanita conducting corn-growing experiments on the land he had purchased near their home in Taylor's Falls, Minnesota. This juxtaposition of Native American spiritualism and corn experimentation points up a crucial feature of Wallace's relationship with Roos with other individuals connected to their friendship. Roos's spirituality grounded in Native American religion was like Russell's based on the affinity for the land, for nature, for the earth itself. As Wallace put it, Charlie laid particular emphasis on the necessity for the American religion found in its roots in our own earth. To Wallace, it seemed to George Russell's assertion that the absence of a mystical feeling about the American soil was the great lack in American culture. Russell allowed that Emerson, Whitman, and Thoreau had the dirt feeling about a living nature, but he believed that Americans, for the most part, had lost it. Wallace agreed. He believed that he and Roos shared Russell's conviction about what would be required to change such a deplorable spiritual situation. All great spiritual movements, Russell insisted, must have a life arising out of Mother Earth. So again, we have the worship of Gaia, the worship of the creation, not the creator. God gave dominion over the earth to humans. We're supposed to be good stewards of God's creation. I'm not saying that we're supposed to, pollute and willy-nilly and trash the earth willy-nilly, but it's not because the earth is the source of all life. It's because God made us stewards of the earth through giving us dominion over the earth, right? So one way that we can respect God is, by taking care of his creation that he had given to us. But again, the Gaia worshippers take it too far by worshiping the earth instead of worshiping the creator of all things, which is God. And, Jesus Christ was who God used, who created everything, right? Through all things were created through Christ Jesus. Okay. For Wallace concerned, as he was a decline of the rural culture of the Iowa youth, involvement with the land, especially farming, one as much a spiritual endeavor as a practical one. It was a feeling that dated back to his childhood, tutoring by the great botanist George Washington Carver, a student of Wallace's father at Iowa State College. The young Henry A. had accompanied Carver on botanical field trips. From Carver, Wallace gained a sense that God was in every plant and rock and tree. The farmer was obligated to call on God, in whom he so deeply believed and felt as a creative force all around him. Wallace allowed that it was impossible to demonstrate scientifically the impact of spiritual beliefs on agriculture, but he felt sure that a true love for one's plants would yield a real result, although it could never be revealed in any statistical array of tables and cold figures. So that later goes to the mysticism that was being practiced by the CIA through The Secret Life of Plants, right? Which was, Christopher Bird, who had strong connections to M. Petty. Let's see here. So Secret Life of Plants. Peter Tompkins as well was the other author. You can learn more about Peter Tompkins, who was a former founder of the OSS. You can learn more about him. Oh, I guess he was recruited by the OSS. You can learn more about Tompkins. You can learn more about Christopher Bird and their involvement to the CIA, and then working with Cleve Baxter. And Cleve Baxter was an interrogation specialist for the CIA, and the use of polygraphing on plants to see, if you talk to your plants and show them love, they grow, so it kind of plays all a role into that. But that's on my Substack, by the way, if you want to read about all that. And their connections to a certain group, the Discoverers. All right. If God or some spiritual essence was present in plants and in the land, then those closest to the land must be suited to nurturing such powers. For Wallace, Charles Roos appeared to be just an individual. Roos' affinity for the earth was strong and clear, and like Wallace, his spiritualism was also tied to Theosophy. By the time Wallace met them, both Charles and Juanita were involved with a group known as the Society of the Temple of the People. Charles, in fact, has been associated with the temple for 31 years. Led by Dr. William H. Dower and Francisca A. Ledoux, the temple was an offshoot of a Syracuse, New York Theosophical Society lodge. In 1903, Dower and Ledoux led their followers to California and settled near the coast north of Santa Barbara. Their community, Halcyon, was incorporated in 1905 as the Temple Home Association, a cooperative colony. The association existed to establish a community where land would be owned collectively and where capital and labor may meet on equal terms with no special privileges to either. It's just another cult. The Temple brand of Theosophy had a strong thread of Christianity running through it, Christianese. A message from the Great Master. Oh, Lord, the Great Master, Saint Germain? First published in 1900 and sent a reprint from the form to Wallace, spoke of the apocalyptic strife, Judas power, the Christ in thine own soul. Yeah, it's just cosmic Christ, theosophical nonsense. It's not Christian at all. As well as gaining freedom from the clutch of the beast that embodied Mammon. At the same time, Dower asserted that the temple was a direct continuation of Helena Blavatsky's enterprise. Other temple material explained to neophyte disciples that they would begin a process of examining their previous lives, referring to the central theosophical principle of reincarnation. In November 1931, Wallace sent his $6 annual dues to the temple and began correspondence lessons in its brand of Theosophy. Dower characterized him as a very fine student whose answers to the course questions indicated a splendid knowledge of Theosophy's fundamentals. Dower also answered Wallace's questions about issues outside the immediate realm of Theosophy. When Wallace queried him, for instance, about the causes of the Great Depression, Dower responded in a manner that touched the very core of the issues that had been troubling Wallace for more than a decade. The Depression, Dower wrote, made it clear that Western civilization, based on commercialism and the competitive system, and so caught up in modern technology, was wrong at the root. Okay? Invoking a credo of the early American Republic, he asserted that the only remedy was a new order of the ages. The New World Order. Now, Talkersy wrote in the chat, Wallace claimed to be the one who inspired Franklin Delano Roosevelt that the reverse side of the Great Seal be featured on American currency. The ability of the Mammon forces to so greatly skew the distribution of wealth proved, Dower concluded, that there will be fundamental flaws in American society that can be ameliorated only by basic social, economic, and political change. Neither the invocation nor the conclusion were lost on Wallace. Wallace also seems to be attracted by Dower's recollections of a close association with a Native American tribe. When Wallace wrote Dower of a trip that he and Roos were considering during the summer of 1932 to a village of the Onondaga tribe near Syracuse, New York, Dower replied that while he lived in Syracuse, he'd actually been adopted into the Onondaga tribe. He described his closest friends in the tribe, including one who was wise in theosophical knowledge. Wallace apparently expressed to Dower his overwhelming desire to meet with the tribe. Later reported the powerful experience of the trip itself. Dower concluded that Wallace must have lived an earlier life with the Iroquois. His desire for contact obviously derived from some cycle of Wallace's life that was manifesting itself at the moment. For Wallace, the Native American religion was important for more than personal reasons. When he first described Charles Roos to George Russell, for example, he stressed Roos' belief that there is a great need of some fundamental spirituality of the old Indian religions being introduced into our modern American attitude. By 1931, Wallace was thinking a lot about how he might help to fill the emptiness in American culture, just as he pondered means to lessen America's social and economic ills. It was clear to him, as the world was collapsing economically in global depression, it was time for a new religious longing to appear if a new order were to issue from the chaos. Chaos to the New World Order, huh? Just as he proved a willing to experiment with social and economic policy as a member of Roosevelt's New Deal administration, Wallace was ready to experiment with possible remedies for the spiritual ailments of civilization. All right. Next, we're going to get we cover part 2. We're going to get to Nicholas Roerich and Helena Roerich reaching out to Wallace, and later Helena Roerich writing letters to Franklin Delano Roosevelt and discussing kind of her plans, but also the plan by the ascended masters for America and America's destiny, quote unquote. So, so we hopefully will finish part 2 soon as we continue to dive into Helena Roerich and Nicholas Roerich, the Roerichs, and Theosophy, and the shaping of America's quote unquote destiny. God bless each and every one of you. Take care, and see you soon.